Hello, and welcome to the Daily Rings of Power podcast, your daily dose of the latest news, rumours, and speculation about the Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power. The day is Friday, August 19th, and I'm your host, Harry. I hope you're having a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening wherever you are in the world. I'd like to start the episode by apologising for the fact we've only put out 3 episodes this week. Unfortunately, it's been a very busy few days for me, and while I love doing this podcast, sometimes there just aren't enough hours in the day. Luckily, we're making up for that today, because the Rings of Power has just released the full Season 1 soundtrack by Bear McCreary. I am so excited. Now, there's nearly 40 tracks to cover here, so we're going to tackle the first 20 today, and then I'll be back with a special Saturday episode to do part 2 tomorrow, where we'll cover the final 19 tracks. Now, please bear in mind, I am by no means a musical student or a scholar, so all of this is just me trying to decipher the clues that a normal listener might pick up in those themes. Secondly, as the soundtrack only came out today, I haven't had time for a full scripted episode, so instead, this episode will be me going through my notes on the tracks and trying to uncover some fun details. Hopefully, you'll all enjoy the slightly more off-script style of today's episode, and together, we can uncover some hidden gems in these tracks. But just because today isn't a scripted episode, that doesn't mean we can break with tradition. So as always, we're going to begin with a reading from the professor's work. This time we're going back to the beginning. The reading comes from The Silmarillion, the Ainulindale, the music of the Ainur. There was Eru, the one, who in Arda is called Ilúvatar, and he made first the Ainur, the holy ones, that were the offspring of his thought, and they were with him before aught else was made. And he spoke to them, propounding to them themes of music, and they sang before him, and he was glad. But for a long while they sang only each alone, all but few together, while the rest hearkened, for each comprehended only that part of the mind of Ilúvatar, from which he came, and in the understanding of their brethren they grew but slowly. Yet ever, as they listened, they came to deeper understanding, and increased in unison and harmony. Okay, and without further ado, we're going to jump into analysing these tracks. Now, first off, I should say that I absolutely adore this music. I think Bear McCreary has knocked it out the park. Personally, I didn't really have any doubt that he would. I've been a big fan of his music. I've talked in the past about his great work on shows like Black Sails, Outlander, Battlestar Galactica, and he's also done one of my favourite video game themes of recent years, which was the God of War soundtrack. So I'm not at all surprised he's done such a good job here, but even so, even with those high expectations, I was absolutely blown away. So we're going to go down the tracks in release order as they appear on all the other platforms. I know on Amazon Music there are 2 additional bonus tracks. We're going to cover those at the end of our track list, so they'll come at the end of tomorrow's episode. But for now, we're just going to focus on the first 20 tracks. Now, the first track is actually not by Bear McCreary, it's by Howard Shore, because he's returned from the Lord of the Rings films and the Hobbit films by Peter Jackson to return to do the main theme of the show. Now, there seems to have been a mixed response to this on Twitter, some people saying they really like it, others saying it's very disappointing or it doesn't seem to capture Shore's music from the original. For me, it does feel very much like classic Howard Shore fare. I think, personally, it works functionally for title music, it works very well, and I think a lot of it will depend on what the opening credits look like to match this. There could be a story that's being told there, so we'll have to see. But I also think that people expecting Howard Shore to kind of recapture lightning in a bottle for a third time, I just think that was maybe a bit too ambitious of people. And it does actually remind me why I've been saying for a long time that we really need to avoid nostalgia when it comes to adaptations. Peter Jackson's films are great, I love them, but we shouldn't be trying to replicate them, and that doesn't just go for the visual design, it goes for the audio as well. So I'm a bit mixed on this one. I do like it a lot. In parts, it reminds me of Rivendell's themes, but in parts, there's also this dark quality to it, especially in the middle section. And it's only a short track, it's about 1.5 minutes long. But I do like that darkness in the middle is only temporary, and we actually return to a much lighter tone by the end of it. So I think what we'll likely see here is that the opening credits, where I imagine this main title theme will be used, is actually there to show us the journey of the Second Age, this start in the light, in the hope, in the peace, in the aftermath of the First Age, the darkness of Sauron's return, and then obviously the light coming back to eventually win at the end of the Second Age. It's very difficult to say. I couldn't pick up on a lot of details here, and because it's not scored by Bear, I also think it's harder to draw parallels to the rest of the tracks. But again, I would say it's lovely, it sat well with me, but it doesn't blow me away. And when I compare it to the rest of the themes and the rest of the tracks, it does leave me wishing that we'd had Bear McCreary do the opening theme as well, because I think he's done some great title themes in the past. Okay, moving on to our first of the character themes, we have Galadriel's track. Now, we've had this track out for several weeks, if not a month now. I don't want to spend too much time today going over things that everyone's already heard. I tweeted out today that the Tolkien Experience podcast did a great and very musically literate analysis of this theme along with Sauron's theme, so I don't think that I'm going to be able to add much here. I think it's really beautiful, though. I think it's one of these tracks where you can feel the character inside it. The first 1.5 minutes of me fills me with an idea of hope and memory and loss and all those things that we know Galadriel is bringing with her into the first age. But then as we hit that kind of 1 minute 20, 1 minute 30 mark, we hear this swelling sound. And I think it's really meant to represent the majesty of Galadriel and the majesty of the House of Finarfin. I think it's meant to speak to the legacy of her as one of the greatest elves of Middle-earth, but also the fact that she has this long lineage from the years of the trees in Valinor through the House of Finarfin and through the First Age. So I think there's this element that Galadriel is carrying a lot of sadness with her, but she's also still very proud, and she still has this inherent power, which I'm sure we're going to see across the series. Moving from Galadriel to Khazad-dûm, I mean, I don't quite know what to say about this track, except it feels to me like Bear McCreary is he's just showing off already. He's just showing the majesty of a dwarven kingdom at its height. And while I don't dislike the Hobbit soundtrack, I always felt there was a missed opportunity there for Howard Shore to really give us a complexity and a depth to the dwarvish music and the dwarvish feeling. And I think with this track, you get this sense of power, of strength. These are very deep, powerful sounds. There's a rhythm to it. It's quite repetitive in a way, but in a way that generates, like I said, power and emphasis and this real feeling of a kingdom at its height. For those of you who are a fan of his work from God of War, you'll really recognize here his use of percussion, horns, that deep vocal chanting that almost it has that feeling of something not primitive but almost prehistory. It's got that feeling of music that comes out of the land itself, and I feel he's really employed that beautifully here. It's also a track for me that builds in momentum and it builds in strength throughout. I think as it builds, you just get these layers upon layers of depth, and because of that, I think you get this sense not only of the Dwarven Kingdom at its height, but how far it reaches and the wealth of the kingdom and how far they're delving. For me, it's all about a sense of scale with this track. Moving from Dwarves to Harfoots, track 4 is Nori Brandyfoot's theme. Now, we know that Nori is kind of going to be one of our key lenses for the show when it comes to the Harfoot characters, but immediately what you get here is flutes. I mean, that's what we need to say. The flutes are back in town. It's not actually very similar to me when you compare it with the music they've used for Hobbits in the Peter Jackson films, but I think it's a very different sound, and we'll get onto that in a later track that's the more general Harfoot theme. It's a beautiful track for me, and the addition of the hurdy-gurdy, which is a fantastic instrument to both hear and to say, it's such a clever choice for me. It gives it a much more rugged feel, it gives it an earthiness to it, it gives it a sense of the pastoral and the rural, and I love that. It's also an instrument that Bear McCreary loves to use. He used it to great success in Black Sails, and he has this ability to make the music feel like it's coming out of the world you're watching, and I immediately felt that with Nori's theme. But then what's interesting is if you listen, the strings that enter after that first minute give to me a sense of the idea of Nori's wanderlust and her desire to see other things beyond the strict path of her own people, which we know is a core idea for her. And then when you go to the last 40 or so seconds of the track, you actually get the same chord progression or motif, perhaps. I'm not a musical expert, but you get that same pattern from the later track we'll discuss tomorrow, This Wandering Day. It's a really small thing, but it ties the individual Harfoots back to each other. And so it's lovely seeing Bear take these little chord progressions or leitmotifs and just bring them together in different tracks so you can feel that sense of musical continuity. Still sticking in the realm of the Harfoots, we then have the Strangers theme. I'll be honest, I really wasn't sure what to expect with this track, but the opening was a lot more gentle than I would have guessed, especially when you consider his literally meteoric entrance to the series we know we're going to see. It's a very soft and gentle theme. There's a lot of the similar instrumentation to the Harfoots in terms of strings and flutes, but there's also some, I think, more mysterious chimes and maybe additional woodwind instruments that's playing around there, and none of those more abrasive hurdy-gurdy sounds. So I definitely think there's something more ethereal in this track, but it really works for me. Then, as we reach the 3-minute mark, it starts to become more somber and rises up to a much more imposing tone. It reminds me a little bit of the track Reach of Your Godhood from God of War, and I do wonder whether this is building on the idea that the stranger has a much deeper, hidden power that he's going to discover across Season 1. Then when you look at the last minute of the track, we have this entrance of the trumpets and the brass, and we have the choral vocals reach, what I would describe as an almost terrifying intensity. And for me, it almost harkens back to the idea of the Ainulindale, the music at the beginning of the creation, this overwhelmingly beautiful but almost imposing music that in its scale that actually pushes you back a little bit. And so I wouldn't be shocked if, because we suspect that the stranger may be one of the Maiar, perhaps even a wizard, one of the Astari, I wouldn't be shocked if this is a way of linking that back. I mean, I personally, I remain convinced the stranger is some form of Maiar and probably a wizard, so that may be what's influencing my analysis here. Now, whereas the stranger started off gently, Numenor is just imperious right from the get-go. Obviously, we've seen this visual design of Numenor in recent weeks, which is drawing on Byzantine, Mediterranean, many other cultures, many other design cues. And I feel like in the same way, the opening to this track feels very different to anything else we have on the soundtrack. It's got a very different identity to it, and I think it's something that we haven't heard from the likes of Shaw, or where we have heard it, it tends to be Western composers trying to represent, I use this term in inverted commas obviously, but Eastern sounds, and so I wonder whether Bear's drawing on something like that, but again, I just don't think I have the knowledge here to know exactly what's at play there. But then what's interesting is as we reach around the 120 mark and pass, it all becomes about grandeur with this climbing, soaring theme, and it almost sounded to me like the theme was never going to stop rising. But I think what's interesting, and this is a little bit like Howard Shore's main theme for the show, the middle section after the 2-minute mark, it's not without some slightly more subtle and darker undertones. And I think that might be there to suggest the unrest at the heart of the Kingdom of Numenor. And I mean, for those who know the story of Numenor's rise and fall, this will obviously come as no surprise, but I do like that they're playing with a range of the light and the dark in this track. And I also wonder, given that these two characters haven't had individual themes so far, I wonder to what extent some of these musical cues within this track will build into individual themes for Miriel and Pharazôn in later seasons. Now, again, the Sauron track, which is next, we've had this a few weeks. As I said, go listen to the Tolkien Experience podcast on this. But for me, this is an incredible piece of music. The chanting at the start, which I assume is black speech, and I've heard other people speculate on what exact language, what exact words are being spoken within this part of the track. When you combine that with the frenetic strings that come in and out of the initial section, it really builds tension for me. But I actually think the real genius of this track begins at around the 120 mark, when we hear this beautifully angelic vocals that join the theme, and the strings go from frenetic to almost serene. And this section only lasts about 20 seconds, but I firmly believe it's at the heart of Sauron's identity. He is, as we've discussed on previous episodes, a fallen Maiar. He's an angelic being corrupted by the first Dark Lord. So there's always going to be an element of Sauron's character that has light in it. And if we even harken back to Elrond's famous line from The Fellowship of the Ring, where he basically says, nothing is evil in the beginning, or not truly evil in the beginning, not even Sauron. So while he's obviously going to be the villain, it's very important, especially when we consider his deception of the elves in his fair form as Anatar, that he can appear fair to other creatures, but also be channeling some part of him that does have a mote of light within it. Switching tracks, or maybe this is quite thematically consistent considering who we just talked about, we then move on to the Valinor theme. I mean, what do we even say here? It's just so beautiful, and even the idea of a track named after Valinor is not something I thought I'd ever hear. The fact that there's such musical consistency throughout this piece, it suggests to me that it's meant to represent the idyllic, the paradise-like nature of the Blessed Realm. But there's also something otherworldly about it to me, and because of that consistency all the way out, because it almost stays in that same register and tone and that emotional feeling for me, it sits at odds to the rest of the soundtrack, almost like something trapped in time. And I do wonder to what extent this is trying to capture that reflection of Tolkien's themes around the idea that the world, the Arda, was marred by Morgoth in the beginning of time. And because of that, it's never fully whole or perfect as the one god Eru intended. So I wonder whether this idea of Valinor being perfect in a sense, but it's perfect because it's almost like a quarantined bubble and there's something unnatural about it, and it's not quite the design as it should have been. And I wonder to what extent there's an idea at play there. Then we move from Valinor to In the Beginning. Now I have a lot to say about this track. It's one of the longer tracks in the album, and I think it's that for a reason. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I think this is absolutely going to be the track used, not just in parts, but for the whole of the prologue of episode 1, which we've heard from reports and from the cast and crew is a flashback to the First Age, telling us the history of the elves and the war with Morgoth. And I think you can hear the exact moment in this track where Morgoth is going to come into this prologue, which up until this point will have been very idyllic. He's going to come into the prologue and kill the two trees of Valinor. We're going to, as we've seen in that leaked picture, the shadow is going to come up behind them and the darkening of Valinor is going to be depicted on screen. And so just after the 2-minute mark, I think we're leading into that. And then we actually hear a version of Galadriel's theme that feels much more sorrowful to me. And I think this may represent the grief grief of the elves, it may represent their departure during the exile of the Noldor, it may even represent the kinslaying if we get to see that on screen, but again, I'm very much in two minds about whether the show will have the rights or will even want to tackle that. Then, around the 3-minute 20 mark, we start to enter into this, again, much more fast-paced, frenetic, a stressful part of the soundtrack. It's still based on Galadriel's leitmotif, but with added horns and percussion, followed by, again, these, I keep using the word, but they're almost terrifying choral vocals. And this leaves me thinking, is this section going to be the horrors of the Wars of Beleriand? Is this where we see those scenes from the trailers of elves surrounded, fighting, flame everywhere? It could be. We could even be looking at scenes where Galadriel's family is dying, her brothers. Then as we hit the 4-minute 45 mark, we return to that more somber Galadriel theme, which I'm guessing is her mourning her brothers, but again, it goes on for a little while, so maybe I'm reading too much into it there. And then as we hit the 5-minute 30 mark, it is Galadriel's theme resurgent again, but this time there's a warlike drum beat, and I wonder if this is literally her on the warpath. You know, following the loss of her family, there's a martial element to that percussion in the background for me, and I wonder if it's to represent her own character transformation to being on the journey, or at least reaching the part of her story we know they're exploring, where she's out for vengeance, she wants revenge on Sauron, she wants to finish the job, she wants to finish her task of stamping out evil. And then when you look at the last minute of the track, or I should say listen, I'm just going to guess here and say that this might be representing the War of Wrath, when the Valar came back to Middle-earth along with the elves of Valinor in a great host, and they were finally able to defeat Morgoth, but in doing so caused massive destruction, because that part of the track for me just feels so intense and so grand in scale. I can't think what else we'd be seeing there. Again, this is all based on the speculation. This is part of the prologue. But if that is the case, I really love that the track leaves us on this last ominous, deep, that really bone-chilling note that leads us into the aftermath of all this death and destruction, which I think will really set up the audience for the Second Age. So I think that's where that track's going. Again, I appreciate there's a lot of speculation there based on 8 minutes of music, but I think it could be, and I think it's really interesting. Moving from that very long track back to a character theme, we have the Elrond half-elven theme. I almost don't have notes on this track because every time I listen to it, it's just so beautiful, and it makes me happy to hear an Elrond theme that is joyful given how much sorrow we know Elrond has. We know he has a lot of sadness behind him at this point in his story, and we also know there's a lot of sadness in his future, both in the Second Age and in the Third Age as well. And so I love that we're getting this more optimistic theme from him here. Again, I'm not any kind of musical scholar, but I feel like there are moments in here, and I've seen others say the same, that this theme seems to echo or maybe parallel the Numenor theme. It's almost like a softer version without that grand soaring part that we saw in the middle of Numenor's theme. And that would be a really nice touch if it is the case, given that it was Elrond's brother, Elros, who founded Numenor. So having that musical link between his elvish half in Lindon and the part of him that is human through the music would be really nice. Overall, it just has a really nice fairy tale quality to me, which I love for the future Lord of Rivendell. When you think about the way Elrond and the elves were depicted in The Hobbit, in the original Hobbit by Tolkien, there is this far more fairy tale quality than we've seen in later adaptations, where they're, I don't know what the word is, they're so impervious to everything, and they're so grand and beautiful that they almost seem alien in a way. And I think the fairy tale element is a little more playful and of nature, which I'd love for the show to explore. But the way this track soars after the 2-minute mark is really just stunning, and I think this is one of those tracks I will definitely be listening to on repeat just because it's really uplifting. Moving from Elrond to who we suspect, based on recent promos, might be Elrond's best friend outside of the Elvish kingdoms, we have Durin the Fourth's theme. Now, this is probably the most jolly, jovial tune we have on the soundtrack, and I just love it. It really gives me echoes of Bear's work on Black Sails, where he talked about how he used period instruments to give the feeling of the music being played on the deck of the ships. Because when you have the setting of a show in the age of piracy, you don't want music to feel discordant, like it's coming from another place. And I think that's what I like about Bear's work here, and I'll get back to this theme specifically in a second, but he's using what sound to me like an almost more medieval take on the soundtrack, whereas I felt like Howard Shore's was something much more classical, much more refined at times, and Bear's music, I think, really feels like it's coming out of the world, and I really feel that with Durin's theme. It's got a really lovely rhythmic quality to it as well. It feels obviously similar to the main Khazad-dûm theme, but this is clearly more there to reflect Durin's passionate, expressive personality that we've heard about both from Owain Arthur and Sophia Nonvetti, and we've also just seen the clips. He's a bit more playful, he's a bit more full of life, and he's a bit more exuberant. But I think what's most interesting with this track is that last minute, because the last minute becomes something much softer and more regal. The same tune is there, but I think there's no doubt that this depression of that tune and this pushing down is a musical reference to the fact that when he takes on the kingship, as he eventually will do, when he takes that on one day, and the weight of that responsibility is physically going to push that side of him down, those lighter, those bubblier tones are going to be pushed down in the same way his own independence and personality are, and it's going to be replaced by something that has much more weight and responsibility. So I think there's a really interesting interplay at work there. Moving to Harfoot Life, this track, in many ways shares a lot of similarities with Durin's, because once again, it has that feeling of the music coming out of the world. McCreary's use of the hurdy-gurdy from the get-go immediately tells you everything about the culture. It immediately tells you that this is a culture of hobbits, or pre-hobbits, we might say, that have a very distinct identity, that have a very distinct perspective on themselves. And so I think it's undeniable that what McCreary's going for here is to separate it from the kind of tunes and themes we heard in Peter Jackson's films. When I first listened to this, I immediately thought, well, this clearly doesn't sound like the famous Concerning Hobbits track. But while it doesn't sound like that, and while it bears no musical resemblance to that track, it does have similar tones, and it does have a similar feeling of a culture which is less borne by the weight of its race and its people. It's more about community and family and those relationships to nature. I think the combination of the hurdy-gurdy with what I think I heard was a xylophone gives us that very playful and yet simple tones, as if to almost represent the nomadic and bare-bones lifestyle the Harfoots live. Like I said, very different to Concerning Hobbits, but in my view, it's equally delightful. It's just different, but I do really like it. Moving from the Hobbits to a very different track is Bronwyn and Arondir. I mean, I'm sure it's not just me who'll be saying this, but this track is just screaming at me that there is not going to be a happy ending for Bronwyn and Arondir. I mean, from start to finish, there's this melancholy, there's this sadness behind it that really resonates for me. And while there are hopeful notes along the way, or these almost interplay of light themes throughout it, I think this is just a big musical clue for us. We know that this is going to be a forbidden romance, but I think, as a lot of us have expected, this is almost certainly going to be a doomed romance, whether it's Bronwyn dying of old age as a mortal, or whether it's Bronwyn dying of something more violent, or maybe we have the opposite view where it's actually the immortal elf who dies, leaving leaving Bronwyn behind. So I think there's a real question here of whether is the romance doomed because of circumstances, or because of their nature, or because of events that we don't yet know about. But for me, this track just did not give me any hope. I mean, I'm really excited to see their storyline, but if this musical theme is anything to go by, I do not have a lot of hope and positivity for the two of them. And then we move to a really interesting track, the Halbrand theme. Now, Halbrand's character that I've really gone back and forth on. I can't decide whether I'm excited for him, whether I'm just not interested, whether the mystery of who he is and what his purpose is interests me, or whether it just irritates me because I don't have a reason to be invested yet. But the track itself is really interesting to me because, like the character, it is an enigma. There's an element to this piece of music which feels like the kind of sound you'd hear, and this isn't a criticism, but it feels like the kind of sound you'd hear as background music in a fantasy TV show or a fantasy video game. But at the same time, there's something else there. It feels at several points like the theme wants to break out. And when I say it wants to break out, I don't just mean in terms of volume and scale and intensity, but it feels like it wants to break out into something more defined and bold, but it always restrains itself until we hit the 2-minute mark, and then the strings really start to soar. But even then, that only lasts for 20 seconds. So I really feel like we're getting the sense of an identity that is at conflict with itself, that doesn't quite know what it wants to be. But it's super fascinating to me. I have heard some people say that this seems to mirror the Sauron tune. I mean, again, I just don't think I know enough about music to be able to notice it, and I can kind of hear it, but at the same time, I recognise we're all trying to find any crumbs we can to validate our theories about Halbrand, so I think if you want to hear Sauron's theme in there, you may hear it. If you don't, you won't. I remain sceptical. I still think Halbrand is much more likely a future Ringwraith than he is Sauron, but I could be wrong here, so I'm going to leave that one open to interpretation. Moving on from a character theme to something that is now much more, I think, scored for an individual scene, we get track 15, which is The Boat. Now, this is almost definitely the tune for Galadriel and her companions sailing into the west that we've seen in trailers. Again, if you followed me on Twitter or you've listened to past episodes, you'll know that my theory is that Galadriel is going to sail towards Valinor. Either she's going to come to that conclusion on herself, or Gil-galad and Elrond are going to convince her that it's the right thing to do, that she should put down her sword and go and seek peace with her family in the Undying Lands. But because of both the ban of the Valar on the leaders of the Noldor in exile, or just because we know from some of Tolkien's letters that Galadriel's work isn't finished in the Second Age, we know her test that she must pass, that we hear referenced in the Fellowship of the Ring, her test is actually about Sauron and the Ring. So if we take the view that she's sailing into the west, but her work isn't done, then we get an idea of where this track might be going. So if you'll follow me, when we hit the 1 minute mark, I think we hear the same choral vocals that we hear in the Valinor track. And we discussed earlier, everything about that, but I think the reason we hear that is because that's the moment where, as we've seen in the trailers, we're going to see the light breaking through the clouds, and we're going to have that very visual representation that they are approaching Valinor, that they are so close they can almost touch it, they can almost reach out and touch the light. But then as it continues, I think we can maybe hear the moment things start to turn from good to bad, and that's at the 2-minute 20 mark. It sounds to me like this is where things go wrong, and I almost wonder, this is how I'm picturing it in my mind, that the light opens, we get this beautiful visual, and then as they get a bit closer, the clouds close back up, and the skies darken, and everything turns ominous. And that's when we're going to get this storm that will be sent by either Ulmo specifically or just the Valar in general, which is going to send her back to Middle-earth, or by way of Numenor, I should say. Because when I think we hit the 3-minute 20 mark, that to me sounds like the fury of the Valar being unleashed through nature, and we're going to see that storm break against her ship, and we'll likely see the shipwreck. And I think those last few notes are probably going to be us seeing Galadriel cast into the sea, and I think we might even see a cut to black, and if you want my very bold prediction, that's how I think episode 1 ends. Now, this next track either directly follows it or is going to be part of it and carry on through this storyline in episode 2. We have the track 16, Sundering Seeds. As we know from the promos, Galadriel is adrift at sea, battling the weather, and even some kind of sea monster. Listen, I don't care. If Galadriel gets to kill a sea monster with a knife in the water, that's super cool to me. I'm all here for it. But I think this does follow on from the shipwreck. And I think this is where we're going to see Galadriel and Halbrand come together, and we're going to have all their scenes being rescued by Elendil's ship when they end up near Numenor. But I think diving into this track a little more specifically, at 1 minute 10, we have this the only way I can describe it is haunting. It's a haunting rendition of the Galadriel theme, but it's performed by a single female vocalist. And I wonder if this is when we find Galadriel at her lowest moment. Maybe she's still in the water, maybe she's just somehow defeated the sea monster, but she is just drained and almost feels like giving up. And I think that might be her at her lowest point. But then what's even more interesting is it's immediately followed by the tune of Halbrand's theme on the violin. And not only did that make me rethink Halbrand's theme and his character because it has this hopeful quality, but I think it represents that moment they come together as castaways in the Sundering Seas. And while I don't believe these promos that seem to show almost a kind of flirtatious romantic angle between the two characters, I think that's just misleading trailer editing. I do think they're going to have almost a kind of brother and sister in arms type scenario. We know they're going to fight in Middle-earth. We know they're going to meet each other in this perilous situation. And I think they are in many ways going to become companions. Now, like I said, I think Halbrand as a character probably has a dark future ahead, but I think in season 1, their alliance, their bond as warriors and people who are struggling against the odds is going to be at the core of their story. After that, we return to a Harfoot track, which is Nobody Goes Off Trail. Given this is a Harfoot track, very clearly, I should say, by the tune on the hurdy-gurdy that starts after the 30 seconds. But given all that, the opening to this track is very ominous. The deep vocalizations, for me, are the most ominous part of a Harfoot theme we've heard on this album. And judging by the title, I think we're going to find out the dangers for Harfoots when they stray away from their family and from the trail and their desire to stay hidden. There's a real urgency here that picks up after the 2 minutes, and I think you can also feel elements of the Strangers theme at play. As we discussed on last week's episode where we covered the new teasers, I'm really confident that the Stranger, as he unveils more and more of his power, he's going to end up hurting and maybe even killing one of the Harfoots by accident. And I know that's a horrible thing to say, but this track, combined with what we've seen, combined with Nori's Wanderlust, I think it's just a dangerous combination, and I think we are about to see some darkness. Then, after a big break from this setting, we get another Numenor track, but this time for Elendil and Isildur. And this track fascinates me. I'm really interested in this because there's so much potential in the House of Elendil's storyline. We know where they end up at the end of the show through the books, but we know so little about the journey they go on pre the fall of Numenor. And so at the start of season 1, we're really exploring where this family's story could go. And the thing I like about this track is the opening has a very regal feeling to it. It's different to how Shaw portrayed the musical themes of Gondor or Rohan, because to me it feels like there's a humility in the beginning here, almost as if to represent the high lineage they're descended from. But as of right now, they're not rulers, and I think the idea of humility and responsibility and honor and service are actually going to be at play for Elendil, Isildur, eventually Anarion whenever he appears. Maybe he'll get his own separate theme in season 2, perhaps. But I think there's a real humility there, which I really love. What's interesting, though, is then when you hit the 2-minute 30 mark, I feel like some of the instruments and tones we're getting here once again call back to McCreary's Black Sails soundtrack. So this repetition, this rolling drums, the short repetition, I should say, of strings, all gives to me a very nautical feel, which is really natural given what we know about Isildur and Elendil's storyline in Season 1. We know Elendil is a great ship captain. We know Isildur is also in the Númenórean naval fleet. We know he's in some ways trying to follow after his father. So I like this idea of this real combination of a regal quality, a humility, a hidden quality perhaps, and also this seafaring element, which is obviously going to be so key. Now we come to what I think is maybe my favourite track in this first 20 tracks. Not because it's something I want to listen to on repeat, but I think it's just so complex. There's so many layers to it. So this is track 19, White Leaves. Obviously, this is a reference to Nimloth, the White Tree of Númenor. I haven't recapped all the news yet this week. I'll do that either Sunday or Monday in an episode for you guys. So if you've missed that, don't worry, I'll catch you up on that. But we've seen that there's going to be several scenes where Nimloth is shedding its white petals. Now in the books, whenever the tree of, whether it's Númenor or later Gondor, is losing its petals or is shedding, its fruit or whatever it might be, it's a bad sign. It's a bad omen, and in the books, Miriel's own father actually has a sort of prophecy about this. So I think what we're seeing in those scenes is Miriel, and I think Galadriel is also in one of them, seeing this shedding of leaves, seeing this bad omen, but maybe they don't quite recognize what's happening yet. They know it's different, but do they quite key into the fact that this is a really bad sign? And do they take the right lessons from it as well? But returning to the track, sorry for the digression there, the opening reminds me of two different works, one by Bear McCreary and one by Hans Zimmer. For McCreary, it reminds me of two of his God of War tracks, that's Memories of Mother and Ashes. And go listen to those. They're beautiful pieces of music. I love them. But they're beautiful and sad. They're very sad pieces of music. They have a lot of memory and grief and fragility to them. But there's also something in the choral quality of this track that reminds me of the Gladiator soundtrack by Hans Zimmer, especially the tracks towards the end of the album, which I'm sure a lot of you will know, the tracks Not Yet and Now We Are Free. Now We Are Free, an all-time great soundtrack, just beautiful piece. It's a high compliment from me, but there is that sense of that choral quality gives something mystical about it, something spiritual about it, which I think is really important when we're talking about Nimloth. And as we talk about the structure of this track, around the 1 minute mark, we're treated to a very somber string theme that at one point fades so much that for a second when I first listened to it, I thought the track might end. But before you let that happen, the strings pick up their tempo and intensity. And I think that middle section then incorporates the Númenor theme, which will obviously represent Miriel and the kingdom as a whole. And it sounds uplifting, but for me, there's a stressful quality of it. The use of those strings and the intensity just almost overwhelms a little bit. And so while it's a glorious visual, no doubt, this great tree, the white leaves blowing in the wind, it's beautiful, there's something slightly worrying about it. And then what's most interesting to me is you get Galadriel's theme entering at the 3 minute 30 mark. And you can really miss it because while it enters at that timestamp and it appears to be building for about 6 seconds, it completely gets just swept away because it crashes against that hard percussion, the brass sections, which drown it out. And so all of this is to say, as I've been talking about on Twitter all week, this sign of Nimloth leaves shedding is not a good omen, but are Galadriel and Miriel going to take the right lesson from it? I think they're going to take the lesson they need to go to Middle-earth to fight Sauron, but they're not going to recognize that this is actually a sign of the internal division, corruption, and the eventual downfall of Númenor, which comes from a very internal place, not an external place, despite the role of Sauron. And I do wonder whether this discordant percussion element that overwhelms all these other themes. I wonder if it's there to represent Farazan as well. I wonder if that is going to build into his theme, perhaps in Season 2, which would be a really lovely touch for me, and it would be laying the groundwork for future seasons as someone who is discordant in their presence and is going to overwhelm all the other players on the scene. You know, he's going to overwhelm Miriel, he's going to overwhelm Numenorean society, but even when it comes to the initial defeat of Sauron, Farazan is going to overwhelm all the counsel and advice of everyone else when he takes him captive. And just to close, I realise I've talked about this track for a long time, but the last 40 seconds of the music are very interesting as well, because we do get that Numenor theme we've heard in the earlier track resurgent at the end, as if, you know, as almost as if to say, you know, despite this fell omen, the kingdom is going to continue to rise. Now, we know that's not going to be true forever, but it is interesting that it's still resurgent, as if to say this omen is going to be ignored in some ways. This last track is really interesting to me. So, Secrets of the Mountain. This is the last one we're going to cover today. But it's really interesting to me because it very much depends what mountain you think this is referring to. I've seen some people say they think it refers to Mount Doom. I don't think so at all. I think the musical cues, and just given where we are in the show, is very much Khazad-dûm. It very much sounds dwarvish. I think it's even using some of the same chords and motifs that we heard in that Khazad-dûm theme and the Durin theme. The opening beat itself feels very thematically aligned, and then the mixture of the strings and the female vocals as we progress, that speaks to me of discovery, of beauty, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if that part of the music, that's going to be our cue for Mithril, which we know is going to play a role in this season. We know Durin's finding a lot of it. We know Celebrimbor is after it. He wants access to it. But as we pass that 2-minute 10 mark, we arrive at a much more ominous tone. And I think that ominous tone is going to signal the danger to the dwarves of, you know, the classic line, delving too greedily and too deep. I suspect, in a way, this track could be used in a part of the scene we saw glimpses of in Thursday's teaser, the scene of Elrond and Durin in the caverns below Khazad-dûm. And I wonder whether this is Durin showing Elrond the Mithril and showing the great wealth they've discovered, but at the same time Elrond knowing that, you know, this is going to come at a price. What's interesting is the opening beat, that opening rhythm, comes back resurgent in the last minute, and I think that's there to show that despite the danger, despite the risks, the dwarves have this resilience and determination to keep exploring and mining, you know, no matter the danger it might hold. So much like the White Leaves track we talked about, I think to some extent one of the themes of the music of Season 1 is this idea that danger is present, but not everyone is taking it seriously enough, and not everyone is realizing the ways in which their actions are going to lead to future harm. So that's the end of the first 20 tracks. We're going to cover the next 19 tracks tomorrow. Obviously, I'm going to try and record this around the same time tomorrow, so this is going to go out, fairly late in the evening UK time. I'll try and get it out around the same time tomorrow. It may be a little bit later, as I'm actually moving house tomorrow, so don't mind me if it comes out a bit later in the evening, maybe kind of more evening US time. But we're going to cover the final 19 tracks, and you guys definitely come back. It's got my favourite tracks in the whole soundtrack. For those of you who follow me on Twitter, you know which track is my favourite. I'm not going to spoil it for people who haven't seen, but come back tomorrow so I can talk about my favourite track and talk about some of these tracks which I think are going to appear in the last few episodes of the season. And I think we can do some fun theory crafting. So please come back tomorrow. Let me know on Twitter today what you enjoyed, what you didn't enjoy about my analysis. I can try and tweak it tomorrow. But come back tomorrow so we can do the following 19 tracks. As always, drop me a comment on Twitter below this post. Let me know what you think about these first 20 tracks, which are your favourites. What did you think about some of my theories? As always, I'd greatly appreciate if you could leave a rating or review on whichever podcast platform you use. And if you haven't already, please make sure you subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's episode and any of our episodes as we approach the show, because we're going to have a lot coming up. Thank you so much for listening once again. I'll be back tomorrow with more discussion, not on the news, but on the soundtrack for the Rings of Power. So come back to the Daily Rings of Power podcast for more of that musical goodness. Namaste.